Well, I think the important thing to understand about last Friday is not last Friday, it's everything that led up to it. It's been very clear from the beginning that President Trump views this as a protracted, stalemated conflict, and frankly, it's a proxy war between nuclear powers.
This is directly a Kremlin talking point that the Ukraine war, the Russo Ukraine war, is a proxy war between Russia and the United States. Why? Because Putin does not want to admit that he was losing, and probably still is losing, a war with Ukraine. He likes to frame, he wants to frame his own power in the context of great powers, Russia and the United States. Rubio is also here using the propaganda technique of fear mongering. By saying it's a proxy war between two nuclear powers, he's creating fear and urgency and priming you to buy what he is selling.
The United States helping Ukraine and Russia. And it needs to come to an end. And no one has any idea or any plan to bring it to an end. The plan of the Ukrainians up to now and their allies on Capitol Hill and the people you talk to in other countries is let's just keep giving them as much as they need for as long as it takes. That's not a strategy. On the Russian side, obviously, they struggled early on in this conflict. They're a bigger country. They've made some progress, but by no means are the Russians running away with it either. So it's a stalemated conflict. This was explained to everybody, and it was made very clear. All the president's trying to do here is figure out is there's a path towards peace.
This is the propaganda technique of half truths. All this sounds about right. It has a ring of truth and likely creates agreement in the listener, no matter what side you're on. This agreement has a momentum all of its own, and the listener is being primed to accept falsehoods that have yet to be slipped in.
We have to engage both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians, and we ask the Ukrainians not to sabotage
This
it.
is the propaganda technique of loaded language. Sabotage. It's a strong word. And the unstated assumption is that the Ukrainians are trying to sabotage a peace agreement.
When the vice president made the point that it's going to take diplomacy to get things like this solved, President Zelensky unfortunately made the decision to challenge the vice president and start questioning whether diplomacy is even possible. In essence, sabotaging and undermining the president's plan.
Again, this is the propaganda technique of half truths. Yes, Vance suggested using diplomacy to resolve the war. But what Marco does not say, what he skips over in silence, is Zelensky's response to that. Zelensky recounted all the broken agreements that Putin made with his country. Putin has no track record of keeping his diplomatic agreements.
And so that led to the dust up. I'm glad to see that there's been a reconsideration of that position because I truly believe that this is a conflict that we need to find a way to end. And it's going to require concessions from both sides, but we have to get them both to the table.
How reasonable. I like this guy.
The Ukrainians have to be there. Obviously, it's their country. The Russians have to be at that table. And only President Trump can make that possible.
This is the propaganda technique of cult of personality. Obviously a favorite among Republicans for the last decade. Trump alone can solve it.
That's been the goal. That remains the goal. And that's what we're focused on now.
This is the propaganda technique of repetition. Republicans have received their marching orders and they're marching. They're good at that. The story now is that the plan was always to wait for Trump to be back in office because he alone can fix it. The plan was not to honor the security guarantees that the United States made with Ukraine in 1994. In fact, the plan all along was to break them. Trump cut off Ukrainian aid shortly after the meeting, and he stopped information sharing with Ukraine, intelligence information sharing. This is also gaslighting. Trump is on Putin's side. That is something else that Rubio does not mention. Now, here's a clip of Rubio from before he sold his soul so completely to the devil.
Early 1990s, Ukraine was left with the world's third largest stockpile of tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons on the planet. But they signed this agreement with the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia that basically said, if you give up your nuclear weapons, we, these three countries that signed to this, will provide for your defense and assure you of your defense. And so Ukraine did that. They gave up these weapons. Well, now, this was signed in 1994, 20 years later, one of the three countries that signed that agreement hasn't just not provided for their defense, they actually invaded them. And I want to make a point on this for a second. Think about if you're one of these other countries around the world right now that feels threatened by your neighbors. And the United States and the rest of the world are going to you and saying, listen, don't develop nuclear weapons. Don't develop nuclear weapons, South Korea. Don't develop nuclear weapons, Japan. Don't develop nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia. We will protect you. We will watch out for you. What kind of lesson do you think this instance sends to them? I think the message this is sending to many nations around the world is perhaps we can no longer count on the security promises made by the free world. Perhaps we need to start looking out for ourselves. And that's why the Ukrainian situation is so much more important than simply what's happening in Europe. This has implications around the world.